Past few weeks we've been dealing with past few months with the central idea of the teaching of the biblical record. And I'd like to catch everybody up, and I realize some of this will be old, but I think there's some new things to put into it as well, and then we'll move on from there. Why did Jesus come, and does one preach the preachings of Jesus or preach about Jesus, is a fundamental question we've been asking. For the vast number of churches and churchmen, the teaching has to be about Jesus. It doesn't matter what he taught. What he taught had some sort of a meaning for the future, they argued. And what was important for now is not his teachings, which are only an example of where the future life will be, but how you get to the future life. This is patently a misunderstanding of the biblical record. It's patently a case where you have a theology and look for an excuse to preach it. It's patently a case of not trying to understand actually the will of God, but really to impose upon God one's own will. And if we had the time, I would back up all those statements very carefully, showing you how the individuals who hold this theology have gotten to it and where they've gone astray. As a matter of fact, Jesus himself very clearly indicates that he came for one purpose and one purpose only. What was it? To preach the kingdom of heaven. For this reason I am come, Jesus is recorded to have said. Now, it's interesting. Those of you who know European books know they're extremely expensive, and they don't even bother to cut the pages. So if you were to pick up this book, you'd see I haven't gotten very far in it. The reason is because the introduction was so challenging that I put the book aside and thought about it for several weeks, and I'll get back to it during one of my periods of reading. It's by a French Roman Catholic, an excellent New Testament scholar, Joseph Bonservant, who I think is extremely interesting as he's writing in this particular book on the kingdom of God. We'll come back to that in just a moment, but to show you that what I'm saying is recognized, although it's difficult to follow it through. The ordinary object of the preaching of Jesus was the kingdom of God. I'm just roughly translating as I read. The Gospels report to us that his first appearance in Galilee, he preached the gospel of the kingdom of God. It is also said that in the course of his ministry, he taught of or regarding the kingdom of God. When he sent out the 12, the apostles on a mission, and also the 70, another instance in the New Testament, he charged them to preach the kingdom of God. The prayer which he taught us and which we repeat every Sunday, he said, "Thy kingdom come." Well, we could go on. But the fact of the matter is that nearly in every single instance when we have the teachings of Jesus, they relate to the concept of God coming within you. The kingdom of God is a here and now reality, both now and into the future. And the exciting thing about it is it not only has come, but it's within each one of you. If you have that as the main thrust of Jesus' teaching, then it seems to me that our main thrust ought to be exploring what happens when you recognize that fact. We ought to help people be convinced and convicted, to borrow a good word, of the fact that God is in their lives, that God does reign in their lives, and that God does have something to say about it, but at the same time, we need to spend more time talking about what that means. And so consequently, I'd like to pick up on "Thy kingdom come" and take a look at it. In the first place, the author of this book does not use the French word kingdom. Very interesting. He talks about the reign or the rule of God. Let me again quickly do a fast translation of why, and let's explore it. This is what caught my attention, and this is why I haven't gone any farther in the book. He talks about the Hebrew and the Aramaic and what these things are. The kingdom of the heaven. The word heaven designates God, according to the current usage. The kingdom of heaven or the kingdom of God are exactly the same kinds of phrases. The word machuta, which is an Aramaic word meaning kingdom or rule, signifies reign, the authority exercised by a king. his empire recognized and accepted. It says nothing of the length of the reign. It designates also the territory over which he has power. The French custom which prevails to use the word royaume, kingdom, signifies only the territory. Now let's pause. Forget all this nonsense now and let's preach. Listen to this. If you talk about a kingdom, you're talking about nothing more than a territorial right. The Queen of England has a kingdom. It's carefully spelled out. The Queen of the Netherlands has a kingdom. It's carefully spelled out. All of the royal houses of Europe have kingdoms carefully spelled out, but there isn't one that has any power. Their authority is not recognized. They're paid attention to when it's convenient and not paid any attention to when it gets down to the nitty and the gritty. They're a figurehead. Their whole interest is to focus the attention of the people. What has little to do with how people actually live their lives. Right? If you study the royal houses, it used to be different. There was absolute power, the divine right of kings. The power of the king over the people was absolute. They could tax life and death, how and where they moved, and how and where they lived. But today, a kingdom is nothing more than a territory with a figurative head. Now, if you notice immediately and draw the parallel, you have a pretty good understanding of what has happened to the kingdom of God in most places. God has a territory. It's the world. It's heaven and earth. He has no real power. He is a figurehead in most lives. Nothing more than something that you call out to when it's convenient. But when it gets down to the nitty and gritty and making decisions of life, the ethical, moral decisions where you have to struggle, God is unimportant. Tax laws are far more important than how you decide to use some of your money than concepts of God. Or a whole host of other things. And so to talk about the kingdom of God in the contemporary age, argues our priest, is to talk about a failure of understanding of the real, obvious power of God in life. It's to separate God from us, to pay tribute to one who really has no power. On the contrary, au contraire, says the man, you should understand it as the rule of God. Now, what does a king with rule have? Authority, territory, power, obligations, established contact, ability to make demands of and to expect payment back in terms of service. I don't have to go any farther than that. I just ask you a very simple question. What's your concept of God? Be honest. Don't answer out. You don't have to argue with me. You don't have to argue with anybody. But did you have the first concept of God honestly? I did. God was a nice figurehead. You came to church, you prayed, you said certain phrases, and that's all it really meant. When the going got tough and you had to make decisions, you didn't make them. You just waited for God to do it. It's God's will. If God wills it, it'll be done. But in the second concept, where you are a citizen of the kingdom of God, you bear all the responsibilities of any citizen of any kingdom. You have to react to the will of God. You can deny it. You can stand up and abuse it. But you still are responsible for recognizing ultimately the power. Now think about it. What happens in your life if you really begin to ask the question, whose will is being done, mine or God's? And how do I know God's will? And how do I establish a relationship with God that lets me do his will? How do I understand the kingdom is here now? And how do I relate to people I don't like under God's command? You begin to get into a focus of why the concept is so exciting. Not the kingdom of God, but the reign, the rule, the power, the strength, the ability to demand, the ability to call to task, the ability to hold accountable. The Queen of England doesn't hold any citizen accountable for anything. And that's why so many people like that concept of God. Do it in a good spirit and God will prove it. Doesn't matter what it is. He had the best of intentions. He thought it was right, therefore it's right. There's no objective good. There is no objection outside of you, objective force that holds you to account. Just feel good about it, and it's okay. We want $250,000. We'll blow up $1 million worth of artworks. We'll get our case across. There's no sensitivity to the beauty of art, to the power to evoke over long ages from an individual a response that makes them look at themselves. No, forget it. We feel good, we'll blow it up. That's what we want to do, and hold us not accountable. Get us a top-notch lawyer who openly says, as J. Lee Bailey does, the only reasons I take cases are if they're exciting professionally and there's a lot of money involved. Get a lawyer that appears on a television talk show during a trial and sets a tone for the release so that the American public will not look at the questions of right or wrong and power and how you manipulate, but will all be set up by a powerful speaking lawyer working towards not winning a trial case, but setting the tone that if he loses the case, he can scream a prejudiced trial, and if he doesn't lose the case, the American public will accept it. Where's the question of righteousness? Where's the question of justice? Where's the question of dealing within yourself with how you approach the upheavals of life? Where's the question of what this says about concepts of justice and righteousness and human relations? Lost. Lost in challenging cases with a big fee. Quoted right off television by his own words. For an individual like that, God belongs to a kingdom. We know his territory, we just don't recognize his power. But the rule of God is the most important concept Jesus had. Not only that God was and is in our lives, but that he has a ruling force. Second thing then becomes very obvious. Then what is God's ruling force? Man is the agency of the kingdom of God. This is something else that people oftentimes pass right on by. In Proverbs it says the spirit of man is the lamp of Yahweh. The whole concept of the teachings of Jesus that you don't light a lamp or a candle, as it says in the King James Version, and put it under a basket where nobody can see it. That your lamp must show is a story of exactly the same kind of thing. When the kingdom of God is within you, you show it. That's the only way it can show. It's nice to talk about nature. I love walking in nature. This is not an anti-nature kind of a thing. I enjoy it. It instills within me certain feelings, and it's marvelous. I find God when I walk in nature, not because God is revealed through nature, but because there's the opportunity in walking in nature to let myself out and let God talk. There's only one way the power of God is known in life, and that's through you. Again, I ask you a very simple question. Would anybody know that there's anything different about you than anybody else that you know going to any other church, synagogue, temple, or going nowhere? And if so, what? That you're a kook, get involved in all kinds of committees and what have you at a church? Or that there's something qualitatively different about the way you approach your human existence? That you work and work and work and struggle to truly become the agency of God. The rabbis were very sure of this when they were at the time of Jesus. They point out, interestingly enough, that in the Old Testament writings, God is called the God of heaven, all the way up until what point in history? Anybody want to make a guess? At one point in history, God suddenly is no longer called God of heaven, but God of the heavens and the earth. Guess what it might be? Mount Sinai. God was active before that according to their concept. God was involved with people before that. I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God of your fathers. But after Mount Sinai, God entered into a special relationship according to that concept with man, and he no longer was God of the heavens only, but was the God of earth as well, because now he had an agency, a covenant people who were willing to do and to take the responsibilities of God. It's interesting. Everybody gets choked up about the concept of the chosen people, because for us, chosen means that they have an advantage over everybody else. But the biblical concept of chosen is they have greater obligation. They accept the challenge of God in their lives and try to work it out. They themselves say men have normally 7 rules to live by. They have 613. Because the concept is that the kingdom of God works through the agency of men, and that's the only place it can work. Raises a fascinating question, which I'll pass over, but just throw out for the fun of it. Does that mean that you create a good society by creating a good society, and then that creates good men? A la President Johnson? The great society coming down from Washington to spread out over all of its people, causing them to be a good citizenry? Totally lost in Mr. Johnson's concept is who defines what the great society is. We've seen the results of that. Great society is by definition great. There is no outside objective approach. Or do you create a great society by creating great individuals who grow out of that society and grow into a newness of life, and because they are godly, because they are good, create a new world around them? Those are usually the two choices given, right? Or do you say man is inherently evil? One of the great television productions going on now that I don't watch. I would watch it if I hadn't been reading the book. But there's one thing I cannot do: read a book and see the movie. It's bad to read the book and see the movie. But, months later, like One Flew Over the Cuckoo Nest. No way I'm going to go see that movie. It's been years since I read the book, but it's my book. I got my characters, and I don't need Jack Nicholson to show me what it's like. Now, it's even worse to read a book while you're watching the movie. Rich Man, Poor Man, Irwin Shaw. Just finished it the other night. Won't give you too much of the details because it's partly a moral question. Bad blood. Over and over again. The Jordak blood comes out. As though no matter what happens to them in society, they are manipulating people around them and their blood shows. Good and or bad. Well, the interesting thing is that when you read the New Testament, it doesn't ask those kinds of questions. Those are philosophical questions which we raise because we like to avoid the real issue. The real issue is it doesn't matter whether society is responsible or you as an individual are responsible, you still take the role yourself. Doesn't matter. You can't say, according to the biblical thing, it's a bad society, therefore I'm justified in doing evil. Go sit in any courtroom in the country today, and that's exactly the plea. There's no doubt that somebody has done something wrong. It's a bad society that caused it. Biblical record says, no, you are responsible under God for your own destiny. It may be tougher in a bad society, but the light of God is still working within you, and when you recognize God not as the figurehead of a kingdom, but as the ruler and reigning of a territorial with an imperative on your life, you change those kinds of things. What does it mean? I'll pass this one quickly. Joyce got at it in the prayer. She says, God, teach us. Rough translation, Joyce. I didn't memorize your prayer, but it struck me. God, teach us to live by your principles and not by ours. Remember that? Isn't this interesting? The point comes down to whether or not God actually rules in your life when you can say, as much as I would like to do this, I know that what's required of me as an honest, open human being under God is to do this. Now, most of us don't have that kind of strength. Most of us go ahead and do something and then spend all of our time trying to find a rationale for doing it. That's why the idea that society's to blame, my parents are to blame, my teachers are to blame. I can't read because my teachers don't teach me to read. All this all pushing off to somebody else ultimately falls outside the concept of God and life. God in life says when you face any decision in your life, it ought to be made not on the basis of your own inner principles and feelings and wants and desires, as important as they are, but upon principles hammered out in a godly manner under him. That's easy to let pass by. It's so obvious that it ought to be instantly true. The tragedy is it also means we have to change our lives. When we're depressed, we have to come up because God would have us come up. And when we're flying high, we have to recognize the needs of the world and be willing to crash a bit because that's part of what it's all about. When we're in pain, we have to be joyful for those who aren't in pain and not be unhappy about them and accept the working within pain so that we know that whatever it is flows out of us to help other people. When we're happy, we have to be sensitive to those who are sad. We no longer, if we let God rule in our lives, can fly through life a few feet off the ground, paying no attention to what's going on. We're obligated to share the joys and the miseries of the world and to bring a solution. And ultimately, that solution is God is in your life. Accept it